Before skyscrapers rose in Houston, before oil turned Texas into an industrial powerhouse, there was an island, a glittering jewel in the Gulf of Mexico. In 1900, Galveston was the richest city in Texas. Bustling wharves, electric streetcars, Victorian mansions lined with imported stone and glass. They called it the Wall Street of the Southwest. It was beautiful, powerful, confident. And in September of that year, the Gulf swallowed it whole. This is the story of the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, a storm so violent it killed more Americans than any hurricane before or since. A storm that left 6,000 to 8,000 dead in a single night, reshaped the Texas coast forever, and left one haunting question. Could it happen again? Turn-of-the-century Galveston was booming. The port handled more cotton than New Orleans. Money poured into banks, opera houses, and grand hotels. Residents believed they lived in the most modern, civilized city in Texas. And they had one fatal assumption. Hurricanes couldn't destroy Galveston. The island sat low, yes, only about 8 feet above sea level. But the locals had never seen a direct hit. Even Isaac Klein, the chief weather observer for the U.S. Weather Bureau, publicly stated a hurricane strike was an absurd delusion. There was no seawall, no evacuation plan, no fear. In early September 1900, whispers of trouble drifted in from the Caribbean. Cuban weather observers reported a powerful storm moving west across the Gulf, but the U.S. Weather Bureau in Washington insisted it would curve toward Florida. On September 7th, ships in the Gulf noticed something strange. The water was warm, too warm. The barometer was dropping fast, and the swells were rolling in heavy from the southeast. In Galveston, the morning of September 8th dawned bright and humid. People strolled the beaches, children played in the waves. The water crept higher, lapping at the edges of streets near the wharf. By mid-morning, the wind began to howl. The first surge came around midday, water rushing over the low sand dunes, flooding yards and storefronts. Some residents laughed it off, others moved belongings to upper floors. But then the wind shifted, and the ocean didn't retreat. By 3 p.m., the wind screamed at over 100 miles per hour. Telegraph lines went down. Roof shingles became deadly blades, slicing through the streets. Flying debris ripped apart houses. By 6 p.m., the Gulf surged 15 feet high. Whole blocks disappeared beneath churning brown water. The island itself seemed to dissolve, waves tearing streets apart, smashing houses into splinters. One survivor, Clarence Osley, would later write, "The houses dissolved like sugar in water." As darkness fell, Galveston became a screaming, crashing nightmare. Families climbed into attics, then onto rooftops, clinging to chimneys as water rose around them. Entire houses lifted from their foundations, floating like rafts before smashing into others. At the Ursuline convent, the Sisters of Charity tied children to themselves with clothesline, hoping to keep them from being swept away. Many still drowned when the building collapsed. In another part of town, the St. Mary's orphanage sat in the direct path of the storm surge. Nuns tied the orphans together with rope, each nun responsible for a group of children, and prayed. By morning, only 3 children were found alive. The noise was unearthly. The howl of the wind, the roar of the water, the sound of timbers splintering, walls collapsing, and human voices crying out in the dark. When dawn broke on September 9th, Galveston was gone. The entire island was a flat plain of wreckage, houses shattered into matchsticks, ships tossed onto streets, dead animals and human bodies tangled in piles of debris 15 feet high. Some streets were completely blocked by corpses. An estimated 1 in every 5 residents had died in a single night. Isaac Klein, who had once dismissed the idea of a catastrophic storm, was among the survivors. He would spend the following days pulling bodies from the rubble and leading rescue parties. With thousands dead and the stench of decay filling the air, city leaders faced an impossible problem: how to dispose of the bodies before disease set in. At first, they tried burying the dead at sea. Barges were loaded with hundreds of corpses, taken offshore and dumped. But within days, the tides began to return them to the beaches. There was no choice. Funeral pyres were built. The bodies, men, women, and children, were burned in mass fires that smoldered for weeks. Volunteers worked in shifts, carting corpses through the streets. The survivors refused to abandon Galveston. Within months, they began to rebuild. But they were determined never to face the same disaster again. A massive seawall was constructed along the Gulf side of the island, eventually stretching over 10 miles. Entire sections of the city were raised, in some places by as much as 17 feet, by pumping in millions of tons of sand. It was an engineering feat for its time, but the city's reign as Texas' premier port was over. Houston's deep water port, safer from storms, would soon take its place. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Between 6,000 and 8,000 lives were lost, a number so large it's almost impossible to comprehend. And yet many experts warn that a storm of that magnitude could happen again. Today, Galveston has modern forecasting, evacuation plans, and a seawall. But the Gulf is still warm. The winds can still turn, and hurricanes still form beyond the horizon. The question isn't if another storm will come, it's when.